Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So in today's video, we are going to be looking at 10 and a bonus facts about Shakespeare that I think you should know, especially if you're studying his plays or sonnets at school. I mean, why else would we be interested in Shakespeare, right? So the reason as to why I was inspired to make this video is because I recently finished reading Bill Bryson's Shakespeare, which you can see here. Bill Bryson's Shakespeare is basically a biographical overview of the bard's life, work, and legacy. I got this book from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust bookshop in Stratford-upon-Avon, which I had visited back in April. And by the way, if you haven't already seen my excursion vlog to Stratford, you can check that out right here. I know that Shakespeare biographies don't usually make the most engaging reads, so I was pleasantly surprised to find that Bryson's book was actually a real joy. It's accessible, informative, and believe it or not, fun. There's none of the stuffy academic jargon that usually comes with Shakespearean or literary scholarship, and despite the many facts and details that Bryson takes the effort to include in his book, not once does he come across like this dry lectury historian or professor. So it's well researched but not glutted with minutiae, encyclopedic but never overwhelming, and eloquent but never pretentious. Basically, Bryson comes across like your knowledgeable uncle who's spoken to the best Shakespearean professors in the world and has done the hard work digesting all of the information for you. So my verdict is that if you're studying Shakespeare at all, read it. It will help equip you with the necessary contextual knowledge for a better understanding of Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, and also enjoy learning about it while you're at it. So in the rest of this video, I will be sharing 10 and a bonus facts about Shakespeare's life, work, and legacy that I think any top grade English Lit student should know. So if that sounds like you, make sure that you stick around and let's jump right into it. So Shakespeare was born into a set of favourable circumstances that would have acquainted him with drama from a very young age. The Stratford back in the 1570s was a regular touring stop for acting troupes, and his father, John Shakespeare, was a bailiff who would visit acting troupes to approve payment from town funds for theatrical performances. According to Bryson, quote, "It's reasonable to suppose that an impressionable young man like Will saw many plays as he grew up, and possibly received some encouragement or made some contact that smoothed his entrance into the London theatre later." Now, a fellow Renaissance writer like Ben Jonson may have looked down on Shakespeare's provincialism and for having small Latin and less Greek. But by modern day standards, Shakespeare would have been more well-versed in the classics than any classics undergraduate today. That's because he went to a grammar school which followed a humanist curriculum with an emphasis on rhetoric and Latin. So if anything, schools back then focused overwhelmingly on Latin and would get students to recite and copy lines in Latin in addition to teaching them lots of rhetorical tropes. In fact, Latin and the classics were probably all that was taught back at grammar schools. Subjects like math and science weren't really covered. So Shakespeare probably learned these in his own time. Now, there's a theory that posits that Shakespeare became a Catholic between the so-called lost years of 1585 to 1592, prior to his arrival in London. That said, Bryson states that the evidence for Shakespeare's religious affinities is often vague and mixed, so it's impossible to say how religious Shakespeare was or if he was at all. In any case, Shakespeare would have been savvy enough to know that being or staying a Catholic carried incredible risks under the Protestant-leaning monarchs Elizabeth I and later James I. So even if he had any inkling of Catholic sympathies, he would have kept them private and hidden. By the way, a recurring sentiment throughout Bryson's book is that there's lots of unknowns and strange suppositions when it comes to who Shakespeare was, what he believed in, and how he had lived his life. Biographical evidence for the more private aspects of his life is often potted, unreliable, if not altogether apocryphal. Now, Elizabeth I and James I were monarchs who enjoyed the theatre. They liked it, or at least they appreciated it for its tremendous value in bolstering the court's authority. So being an Elizabethan and Jacobean dramatist then, Shakespeare was born into the most favourable times for his profession as a thesp. That said, plays were strictly regulated by the master of the revels, who was a government official whose responsibility was stage censorship. So whatever Shakespeare wrote, he was also subject to the whims and wrath of the powers that be. Indeed, when he got on Elizabeth I's nerves with the deposition scene in his play Richard II, he had to remove it and was actually lucky not to have received a harsher punishment. After James I succeeded the throne, Shakespeare's playing company was placed under the king's patronage and renamed from the Lord Chamberlain's men to the King's Men, which de facto meant that Shakespeare would not have written anything that crossed political red lines, unlike Ben Jonson and George Chapman's Eastward Ho, with their anti-Scottish jibes which pissed James off big time and landed them in prison. This is also why patronage was so valuable for creative professionals like dramatists and writers back in Renaissance England. As Bryson argues, patrons afforded the actors some measure of protection, and they in turn carried his name across the land, lending him publicity and prestige. For a time, patrons collected troops of actors rather in the way rich people of a later age collected racehorses or yachts. And when you think about it, that's actually quite an apt analogy. By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature. Now, an interesting and important fact which had led to the flourishing of plays back then is the short running season of each production. As Bryson points out in his book, the average lifespan of each play would have been a maximum of 10 performances per year, with many plays being performed 3 times in the first month, but then shelved altogether afterwards. So popular demand for more new material was always high, which meant that Shakespeare and his contemporaries had to be consistently inventive and flexible with their craft. One manifestation of this was his breaking of classical dramatic conventions. Whereas classical drama followed strict generic delineations, for example, by keeping comedy and tragedy separate, Shakespeare and other contemporary playwrights would often fuse comedic and tragic elements in a single play, thus creating moments of what we call comic relief in a tragedy, or even coming up with tragicomedy as a whole new genre. Aristotelian unities, which is the notion that the action of one play must take place within a single day, were also cast aside in tragedies like Hamlet and Macbeth, which would have lost much of their emotional impact and suspense otherwise. Shakespeare's greatness as a playwright largely stems from his ability to assimilate, adapt, and refine prosaic ideas and plot lines into engaging content, and to do so with dramatic aplomb and stylistic flair. He took from Plutarch, Homer, Ovid, and sundry other writers, sometimes even lifting passages straight from existing sources and just incorporating it verbatim in his own work. IP lawyers, look away now. But he would humanize and infuse them with philosophical depth and emotive color by working his magic with language and staging. Instead of going for the sort of gore and garishness characteristic of medieval plays or Senecan tragedies, Shakespeare would develop a more naturalistic, sophisticated theatrical style which placed greater focus on the actor's emotional range and individual talent. He would often write plays with specific actors' mannerisms and traits in mind. For instance, Richard Burbage was the model for tragic heroes, and William Kemp for comic roles, most famously like Falstaff. Now, a fun and impressive fact is that Shakespeare single-handedly coined some of the most commonly used words and phrases in the English language today. Lexicographers generally agree that he had contributed more than 1,700 words to the English lexicon alone. In fact, many words which we have come to take for granted were first created by him, such as critical, horrid, zany, and excellent. He also had a gift for phrase making, with some phrases entering common parlance and even becoming idioms, like play fast and loose from Love's Labour's Lost, go down the primrose path from Hamlet, budge an inch from The Taming of the Shrew. His real genius, though, was in the way he exploited the multiple meanings of words to expand the interpretative possibilities of his plays. This is why there are so many puns in his works, and it is often in his wordplay that moments of sharp dramatic insight are unleashed. The Globe was built by Shakespeare's playing company in 1599, but it had lasted a little more than a decade before it burnt down in 1613. This period, though, was arguably the golden apex of Shakespeare's career, when he wrote some of his best and most timeless plays like Hamlet, Julius Caesar, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, etc. By 1608, though, Shakespeare and the King's Men took possession of the much smaller but more prestigious Blackfriars Theatre, which had staged works by other talented playwrights like Thomas Middleton and Ben Jonson. With this shift from a public, demotic, and accessible space of the Globe to the more private, elite, and expensive arena of the Blackfriars, Shakespeare cemented his status as a heavyweight in the theatrical realm, and of course added to his wealth being a shareholder in the Blackfriars operation. Because don't forget, apart from being an actor and a playwright, Shakespeare was also a savvy entrepreneur and investor. Now, the significance of the 1623 First Folio cannot be overstated. Had it not been for John Hemming's and Henry Condell's efforts at compiling and publishing Shakespeare's plays after the Bard's death, all of them would probably have been lost forever, especially with the Puritan theatre ban in 1642, which resulted in almost 2 decades of no theatrical performances at all, and also the Great Fire of London in 1666, when all of Shakespeare's material remnants were burnt down. So it's a tad bit ironic then that what was originally intended for the stage ended up being best preserved by the page. Now that said, there exist many and sometimes drastic variations between the original quarto publications and folio editions of Shakespeare's plays, with the most striking examples being Hamlet and King Lear. Now, one fact that I find really interesting is that despite Shakespeare's tremendous esteem today as the greatest English writer in history, he wasn't actually very highly regarded up until the Romantic era, when Samuel Taylor Coleridge associated Shakespeare with this imaginative genius concept and restored the bard's place in the literary pantheon. Indeed, even haloizing him for the post-Romantic generation, which continues today. Restoration writers in the 17th century didn't find much of Shakespeare's works palatable or intellectual, and where Shakespeare's works were performed, they would always be heavily adapted. Someone like Samuel Pepys found Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream to be juvenile and crass, even commenting on the latter as the most insipid, ridiculous piece of work I have ever seen. Bit harsh. There's an entire field of scholarship dedicated to questioning the real authorship of Shakespeare's works. While numerous candidates have been put forth, including Christopher Marlowe and even Lady Mary Sidney, the one that has gained the most momentum is Francis Bacon, the natural philosopher, statesman, and prose writer. Others have suggested that Shakespeare wasn't a single individual, but a composite of many Elizabethan and Jacobean writers. So far, though, none of these theories have been convincing enough to topple the reputation of the one and only William Shakespeare, who is still widely regarded as the genius behind some of the greatest plays known to humanity. But what do you think? And that's it for this video, guys. I hope these 10+1 facts about Shakespeare has given you some useful contextual knowledge to know about the Bard's life, work, and legacy. Please do consider reading Bryson's Shakespeare for a fun, informative overview of the playwright's background. I promise that it's an enjoyable book. I'm not sponsored to say this at all, and I would love to hear what you think in the comment section below. Make sure also to check out my other Shakespeare playlists on Macbeth, Othello, and his other plays, which I'll link to in the description box below. And as always, please hit the thumbs up button so that you can help spread my videos to other dedicated, passionate, top-grade lit students like yourself, so that I'll be able to continue making these useful study videos for you going forward. Please subscribe if you haven't already and hit that bell notification so that you don't miss out on any of my videos in the future, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!